Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
David Cameron leapt to George Osborne's defence today, and amid reports of four-letter words being hurled last week, he even praised the outgoing Ian Duncan Smith. Our political correspondent Michael Crick reports.
The storm that raged across the weekend today entered its third full day. Ian Duncan Smith's resignation on Friday night had left all the focus on George Osborne and his budget. But today, he went strangely missing. Instead, it was left an hour and a half ago to the new Work and Pensions Secretary to announce to MPs what seemed to be another dramatic U-turn.
So I can also confirm that after discussing this issue over the weekend with my right honourable friends, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, we have no further plans to make welfare savings beyond the very substantial savings legislated for by Parliament 2 weeks ago, which we will now focus on implementing.
By lunchtime today, things were already looking sunnier for the government. They averted defeat on the budget vote tomorrow by accepting amendments on tampons and energy-saving devices. With the latter, it's thought to be unprecedented for a government to accept an opposition budget amendment. But where was George Osborne? Holed up all day, we hear, working in number 11 and the Treasury. So instead of the Chancellor, Labour's urgent question was answered by Osborne's number 3.
Our economic plan is delivering for Britain. It's a budget that continues this economic recovery, a budget that takes us into surplus by the end of this Parliament, a budget that backs British businesses, protecting jobs in difficult economic times.
5 days ago, the Chancellor stood at that dispatch box, published the budget scorecard with a £4.4 billion cut to PIP. Where is the revised scorecard without it? Is it true this cut is instead going to come from elsewhere in the DWP budget? And if the Chancellor is too scared to answer questions in this House on the issue, he is not fit to do the job.
Later, David Cameron, in full emollient mode, paid tribute to Ian Duncan Smith, but then passionately defended Osborne and rejected IDS's claim that this government doesn't care about poor people who don't vote for it and is no longer a one-nation government.
None of this would be possible if it wasn't for the actions of this government and the work of my right honourable friend the Chancellor in turning our economy around. We can only improve life chances if our economy is secure and strong. Without sound public finances, you end up having to raise taxes or make even deeper cuts in spending. You don't get more opportunity that way, you get less opportunity that way. And we know that when that happens, it is working people that suffer, as we saw in Labour's recession. So we must continue to cut the deficit, control the cost of welfare and live within our means. We must not burden our children and grandchildren with debts that we didn't have the courage to pay off ourselves. So securing our economy, extending opportunity, we will continue with this approach in full because we are a modern, compassionate, one-nation Conservative government. And I commend this statement to the House.
Whatever has happened to the Chancellor of the Exchequer? Where is he today? Because could he not, instead of covering up for his friend, ask him if he'd be kind enough to come along to the House and explain why, for the first time in my memory in Parliament, a government's budget has fallen apart within 2 days of its delivery? Can he guarantee us there's going to be no further cuts in the DWP budget and more people with disabilities facing more cuts as the years go on?
Later, Stephen Crabb did indeed seem to say initially that further welfare cuts wouldn't fill the £4 billion black hole in the budget. But within minutes, we were in total confusion again when the Treasury stated that doesn't mean there'll be no more cuts in this Parliament, just that no more welfare cuts are planned.
Well, Michael joins us now from Westminster. Michael, what is going on?
Well, I have to say the situation is still extremely confused. I don't think I'm just confused, but the people in government seem a bit confused as to where things stand tonight. What seems to have happened over the weekend is that the Treasury, Downing Street and the incoming new Work and Pension Secretary, Stephen Crabb, seem to have agreed a form of words that they have no further plans for cuts in welfare spending. Now, one of the reasons Ian Duncan-Smith resigned on Friday night is that even though by then it was clear that the government had abandoned the cuts in disability payments, the PIPs, his worry was that he'd simply be asked by George Osborne to make cuts elsewhere in the welfare budget. Now, it seems now that Stephen Crabb won't have to do that. It'll have to be some other government department or a combination of other departments, or maybe eventually tax rises to make up for the black hole in George Osborne's figures, the £4 billion black hole that people have been talking about today. But we're always suspicious about phrases about having no plans, of course, in politics, because we've known a number of occasions in the past where politicians have promised this, and then within months or a year or two, of course, they've gone ahead and done that. But I think what one can say with some confidence tonight is that there will not be other cuts in welfare announced this year, but who's to say whether further cuts might be announced down the line, say 2018, 2019.
Michael, thanks very much. Well, amid lots of conflicting messages then on the welfare budget, the £4 billion in savings from the now defunct personal independence payment cuts will have to be found from somewhere else. The Conservatives were elected on a pledge to slash £12 billion in welfare spending during this Parliament, a promise which was seen as highly popular, putting Labour on the back foot. So what's happened to it now? Here's our health and social care correspondent, Victoria MacDonald.
Just 5 feverish days or 3 working days since the Chancellor held his red bag full of budget aloft, and there is chaos. So the first job for the new Work and Pension Secretary was to officially back down, not just on personal independence payments or PIPs, but, he said, no more welfare savings.
I am absolutely clear, Mr. Speaker, that a compassionate and fair welfare system should not just be about numbers. Behind every statistic, there is a human being. And perhaps sometimes in government we forget that.
I welcome the vital and, if I may say so, wholly inevitable U-turn on the cuts to PIP. Mr. Speaker, the way this mess has been handled is a textbook example of Tory social security policy, long on divisive rhetoric, totally lacking in competence and compassion.
The government had promised to reduce the welfare bill by £12 billion, and PIPs accounted for more than a third of that. However, the Employment and Support Allowance, or ESA, cuts pushed through 2 weeks ago will still go ahead. This does still leave a massive £4.4 billion hole that would have been filled by PIPs. And the Treasury was swift to clarify this evening that when the new Secretary of State said no more welfare savings, this did not mean that there would be no more cuts in this Parliament. It simply meant that no more are planned. But one Liberal Conservative think tank today said the government now needed to look at other options, including pensioners.
The £4 billion that needs to be achieved over this Parliament can be achieved by, for example, targeting universal benefits that go to more affluent pensioners. So, for example, the winter fuel allowance, free prescriptions. It's time to look at those things. At the same time, you might get some savings by delaying the increase in the personal tax allowance threshold, as well as the increase in the salary in which you start paying the top rate of tax.
The government has so far refused to countenance any grab on pensions or benefits such as winter fuel allowance. It was an election pledge. And savings elsewhere are restricted by departments that are ring-fenced: health, education and overseas aid. There was relief today from disability charities, but they are still wary. Romina Puma is an ambassador for the Muscular Dystrophy Society.
I still don't know if they're going to do something anyway, because let's say that they're not going to do the cuts on the PAP. They're not going to go forward with that. But in their mind, they want to do something.
Ignore me completely.
In his resignation letter, Ian Duncan Smith said he'd been forced to accept salami cuts to his vision of a new universal credit, which rolls benefits into one. There are now whispers around Whitehall that this policy may in fact face being completely ditched, especially now its architect has gone.
Well, earlier I spoke to the Education Secretary and Women and Equalities Minister Nicky Morgan, and I asked her why the government have performed a major U-turn on the cuts to personal independence payments.
Well, there wasn't a consensus about making the changes. We obviously consulted with disability groups, with people affected, with members of Parliament, but there wasn't a consensus, and so it's the right thing, as Stephen Crabb has announced this afternoon, not to proceed with the changes, and he will then obviously take stock as the new Secretary of State for Work and Pensions.
It's pretty incompetent, isn't it, to announce it in a budget, base all your figures on it, then find out that you can't carry it through, and end up with a £4 billion hole in your budget.
Well, all the figures were not based on it. The budget is a much bigger piece of work involving obviously much bigger numbers.
But every figure counts. You've now got a hole in your budget, haven't you?
Well, what's going to happen is that the changes weren't going to be introduced till 2017, and between now and then we've got another autumn statement, and the Office of Budget Responsibility will produce another set of financial forecasts, and at that point we will make further announcements. But I think it's important to note, as Stephen Crabb said this afternoon in the House of Commons, that there will be no further changes to welfare savings other than what we have already set out as part of our manifesto.
Why were you doing this? If this was such a small amount of money, why were you trying to hit the most vulnerable people when you didn't even need to? You're saying it wasn't even in the manifesto.
Well, firstly, I only said that. As a government, we are spending more as a proportion of our national income on disability benefits than the last Labour government was. We're going to be spending more than police and defence budgets combined. And we spent £2 billion more in the last Parliament, and we've got another £1 billion to come in terms of payments on disability benefits. But, you know, we were elected on a platform and a manifesto to control welfare spending, to make sure that it is targeted at those most in need, and that's exactly what we continue.
I'm not clear whether you've hit the 12 billion or whether it was more than 12 or less than 12. Do you know?
No, the 12.
I mean, this is a total shambles.
No, it's not. It's not at all, because the 12 billion was something that we set out in our manifesto, and the Chancellor.
And then you had to go back on that with the tax credits climbed down.
No, that was set out in the autumn statement. Well, as I say, what we obviously look for in terms of all of the changes is to consult, to listen to people, and to make sure that we can build a consensus.
When you read Ian Duncan Smith's resignation letter, when you watched him on the television yesterday, making very powerful points about getting the balance wrong, about being unfair, about arbitrary amounts being set by the Chancellor that he needs to find, did it make you think at all that, you know, you might not be right on everything?
No, I think it's a great sadness to lose any cabinet colleague, to see any cabinet colleague resign. You know, I can see as a local member of Parliament, when I go to my local job centre, just how much Ian changed the system from one where it just advised on benefits to actually saying to people, you know, how can we support you? How can we help you get back to work?
But he now says he was under pressure. He didn't want to do some of those things. He was forced by George Osborne. He failed to win the argument to stop doing this, and that's why he's resigned. Does that not make you wonder whether you've got it wrong? Or is he just wrong on everything?
No, I don't think Ian is wrong on everything, but obviously the reasons for his resignation, that's a matter for him.
Isn't it incompetent of George Osborne not to have squared this with Ian Duncan Smith before the budget?
I have to say, I think the Chancellor absolutely would square all of the measures in the budget with the relevant Secretary of State.
Well, he was the Welfare Secretary. He was relevant, wasn't he?
Of course he was. Yes, he was.
So why didn't he square it off with him?
Well, because I think the point was that the Ian Duncan Smith was aware of the changes. They were mentioned at the cabinet briefing last week. Well, that's look, that's something for, obviously Ian has set out his point of view, but the point is they were there, they were mentioned at the cabinet meeting last week when the Chancellor took us all through what was going to be in the budget.
Are you saying he's changed his mind? I mean, this is really interesting. I mean, are you saying that he agreed to it and then went back on that?
Well, I mean, I know that they were obviously in the budget, and then Ian has obviously set out his reasons for resigning, which, as I say, I think is It's a great sadness for the government because he was an excellent work and pension secretary who had a real commitment to helping those most in need, to getting people the support they needed to get back to work, delivering on a really important reform in universal credit.
Nicky Morgan talking to me earlier.